Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. We will be getting started shortly. We still have some people that are signing in. I'm just trying to make sure. This is Mike Burke, by the way, with PSBA. If you can hear me, can someone send me a chat and let me know, or a question or something, and just say, hey, I hear you. I just always like to make sure that we're getting out there to everybody. Thank you, Cam. Appreciate it. Always makes you feel a little better. Thanks, Brett. All right, so people can hear us. Okay, and I will leave my question box out here, Rich, so I can take care of any of that stuff. So we're going to give it about 5 minutes, everybody, and we will get started at that point.
I feel like we need background music, Mike. It's like, you know.
Well, this is usually the part where I direct everybody to where the bathrooms are located and where they can find the defibrillators, et cetera. You know.
We got.
By the way, everybody, you are all on mute. Only because when we start to get a group this large, the background noise tends to get a little crazy with all the open mics. So, and I'll explain, you know, sort of how to ask questions, et cetera. I think you've all been. I'm looking at a lot of names on this list, and many of you have been on these before. So we're keeping everybody on mute. But if you have any point have a question or need to chat, you can hit the question function or the chat function, and you'll be able to reach us. Okay.
We're at about, what, 4 or 5 after, Mike?
We're about 4 after. I'm going to give it another minute, and then we will kick it off.
Okie dokie.
Understanding that there's weather in some places, et cetera. I know how this gets.
Yeah, I know that there were a couple of late startups yesterday I was aware of, so they may be either another late startup or just kind of resettling into normal schedules.
Yeah. All right, everybody, we are at 5 after, so we're going to go ahead and kick off this webinar. My name is Mike Burke. I'm the Executive Director for PSBA, and I want to thank you all for joining us again for another one of our START webinars. This one is on a very timely topic, particularly this time of year, I think, and it's how to prepare a contract. And we're very happy to have back with us again Rich Kelly. Most of you already know Rich. You've spoken to him, met him at convention, heard him on a webinar. Rich's little background again, I think I know this by heart, though. Rich is the founding member of R.C. Kelly Law Associates, and the practice is focused on helping commercial operations grow and improve. He developed the firm's business counsel program and contract administration program in response to the unique needs specifically for small and growing businesses that he encountered while working with insurance agents and their commercial policyholders. Rich has gained a thorough understanding of the business organizations while working in legal, technical, and management executive roles for small business and large corporations, and as a vice president in charge of risk management for a major regional insurer. We all know Rich from, many of you know from his work here with PSBA. He knows our industry as well or better than most attorneys out there. Boy, I'm really setting the bar high here, Rich. So without further hesitation, I'm going to, well, let me stop a minute. Welcome Rich on board. Let me, though, while we've officially started, let everybody know that we are keeping everybody on mute because we have a few people who just jumped on to avoid the background noise. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, feel free to use the question function you'll find on that webinar dashboard you have to throw those over to me throughout the presentation, and we'll be able to relay those to Rich as we move along. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Rich Kelly. Rich, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Mike. That's a familiar introduction, like you said. I think we both probably know that one by heart. But I love working with PSBA's school bus contractors. Again, it's something that at Harleysville Insurance, which is now nationwide, that was our biggest business segment. So we've been dealing with school bus contractors a lot of years. Today's presentation, how to prepare a contract, sounds basic, but really it's very much angled to Pennsylvania issues. That is how to prepare a contract for school bus transportation in Pennsylvania. So if there ever was a specialized presentation, this would certainly be one of them. So what we're going to cover is a discussion of school transportation contracts in Pennsylvania, with a special focus on contract extensions. If you've got an existing contract, you're hoping to get that extended, the RFP process that some schools do go through, proposals by contractors, and informal changes during the school year. So that's the general summary. In order, we're going to talk about what makes a contract enforceable or not. What are the rules in Pennsylvania that you ought to know about as you kind of wend your way through that process? We'll talk about having a contract administration plan so that you can make sure that you can put your hands on the contracts when you need them and what you need in order to be sure you've got an enforceable contract. I'll talk a little bit about the evaluation. I call it the grading process that we go through when we help a buyer of a school bus contracting company evaluate the quality of the contracts that they have and why that matters. We'll talk about the process of contractors making just straight up offers. If you're called by a school district that says we'd like you to do a few runs or we'd like you to do all our runs, the process of putting an offer together, the process of extending the contracts that you have, difference between a request for proposal and a request for bid. In Pennsylvania, the RFP process is really much more common, so we'll talk about the RFP process. And then we'll have just general contract considerations followed by discussion, Q&A, whatever comes down the pike there. So that's the plan. And the first of those topics is the elements of a contract. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but anytime you've got a contract that is a desire to be paid for something that you're doing, you've got to be able to prove three things. You've got to be able to prove that there was an offer, that is, someone was going to do something. You're offering to give transportation. You've got to prove that it was formally accepted by the other party. And then you've got to prove that there was consideration, which is the exchange of money. In the contracting world, offer is usually pretty easy and straightforward because there's usually some writing whether it's an email or something, saying, hey, we need you to, run these 5 routes, or we need you to pick up Johnny, wherever and take him here. Usually there's not a big question about consideration. There might be a question about how it's calculated, but usually there is some documentation somewhere that talks about consideration. Often what people struggle with is the acceptance piece, and that's a matter of in order of priority. The best, strongest proof that there was offer and acceptance is something signed by both parties. Kind of goes without saying, but we're going to talk a little bit more about not all signatures are necessarily equal. Second in priority would be something that's not necessarily signed, but it is at least written out. So in other words, if somebody called in and they sent you an email, will you be able to pick up Johnny tomorrow at 7 a.m. and take him to school? And you reply back, sure can, we'll be there. You don't have a signed document, but you have a written document that at least is evidence that there was a meeting of the minds, so to speak. Third, in order of what's best, is a verbal evidence of acceptance. And that's the situation where, and this happens pretty frequently. Instead of getting an email saying, can you pick up Johnny tomorrow at 7 a.m., your dispatch department or you get a phone call saying, hey, we got a new run. You need to start tomorrow morning, 6:30 a.m. And again, nobody's got the time to do the emails. Dispatcher jots it down, talks to whoever's running the buses, says, yep, we got a bus, we got a driver, we're good to go. And they call them back and say, yep, we'll be there, don't worry. Now, at some point, that may get written down, but at that point right there, that is simply a verbal agreement between the two. Fourth, in order of value or priority, would be acceptance by performance. And that's a situation where the expectation is that somebody has asked you to do something, or perhaps they haven't even asked you to do something. I've seen situations where the phone call comes not from the transportation director, but from someone else. But that might be someone else who you historically take direction from. So it's not the transportation director, maybe it's the secretary or the administrative assistant at the school that says, hey, we need you to do this. So you go out, you do it. You might not have actually had necessarily I'll call it a big discussion with the transportation director or something of that sort, but there's enough expectation there that you agree to perform the pickup and you expect to get paid, and 9 times out of 10 that's good enough and you get your pay. The fifth one is by pattern and practice, and this one actually in the school bus world is far more common than people think. I work with contractors all the time. We often are looking at the startup of school, and they may have deviations from, here's the route they gave me, but I know for a fact that I have to do this and this also. Maybe there's a couple extra stops. Maybe you heard about it from a parent. Maybe, whatever the case is. But we always pick up this kid. They somehow, for some reason, left them off the route. I know the parent, they're still there. They're expecting the bus. So that is a pattern and practice. In other words, proof that they've accepted it because they've accepted it in the past. It might be something, again, at the start of a school, or it might be something in the middle of school. Perhaps there was a verbal request, and that request was never written down, but you've been picking up this kid every day since September, and now it's January, and you expect to be paid because they paid for it every other month. That's the 3 levels, and we'll talk in more detail about how to make sure you've got some documentation of that when we talk about contract administration. Next up, if you're talking about the rules, that's the big, broad, general, conceptual rules as it relates to a contract. What you also want to know is what I call the Pennsylvania rules. And when we talk about the Pennsylvania rules, there's really 3 components here. And the one that is most important is that there is currently no request for proposal requirement in Pennsylvania for school transportation. And I know that this is a topic that is often bandied about by school administrators, transportation directors, superintendents, even school board members. In dialogue, I'm working with contractors that have serviced school districts for decades, literally for decades, and they, this year or last year, are saying, well, we're going to do an RFP because the Auditor General, Vince DiPasquale, says we have to. Well, that is true that the Auditor General believes that in his heart and has said that in press statements, but he is not a lawmaker, and his press statements don't create law. So while he individually thinks it's a good idea, it doesn't have the power of law behind it. There have been some proposals along those lines. None of them have really gotten traction at this point, but at this point, there's not a requirement. Now, typically, in helping contractors with that issue, I'll give them articles that have appeared in previous editions of the Pennsylvania School Bus Association newsletter explaining that, this is not a requirement in Pennsylvania. Sometimes I've even written opinion letters that they've sent on to their superintendent. Sometimes that's enough to convince them away from doing an RFP, but very often, superintendent or the school board will say, well, I understand it's not a requirement, but if Vince DiPasquale comes in to audit us, which is possible, I don't want him to be unhappy. So I want to show him that we have done this thing that he recommended, since he's the guy that gives us the grade. It's hard to argue with that, but it's common. The second two items that you have here on the slide, Pennsylvania issues, one comes from a statute, the other comes from a case. Pennsylvania statutes, the PA code, say explicitly, and I quote it there, the board of directors of a school district is responsible for all aspects of pupil transportation programs. What that means is that the person within that dynamic, administrator, transportation director, business manager, the person with the real authority is not any of them. It is the school board. Now, the school board may delegate their authority to the business manager or to others, but by themselves, standalone, they are merely employees of the board. They don't actually have the authority to say yes, no, right, or wrong. Now, I understand that a lot of boards have very much delegated that authority, and it matters whether they have delegated it officially, formally, and in writing, or whether it is just the administrator has always handled this and the board has always rubber stamped what they said. Each one is a little bit different, and you'll get to know your own dynamic. The third item here is a case law, which really kind of drives home what are the standards. When we talk about RFPs, a lot of times people think RFPs and bids are the same thing. They're really not, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But this particular case out of Butler, it's a district and county case, but it's been cited a few times in various areas. And the court, in deciding this particular matter, said that a school board in its discretion may negotiate a contract for the transportation of school children so long as it is done in good faith, not arbitrary and not capriciously. This is the sole criteria currently available to guide a school board in awarding pupil transportation contracts. Now, in this particular case, this was actually as I recall, a disappointed bidder protest. In Pennsylvania, we don't have a formal process for that, but that doesn't prevent you from having the right to file a claim, a complaint, saying that something was unfair and that you believe you're entitled to damages. In this particular case, the contractor that was protesting the award was not ultimately granted the award, but it did force the court to look at who has the authority to do what. And while they gave it to the contractor who, as I recall, was the incumbent, the important part of this was that the only guiding rules, we'll say, is that they cannot simply discard everything and select who they want. There has to be some sort of business sense behind it. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to go with the lowest price. They may decide to go with a price that is higher because they believe the fleet is better, or the management is better, or the contractor is more financially stable, or they have a history, whatever the reason is, there has to be some logical sense to the decisions that they make when they are deciding who gets a contract and at what rate. And that's an important part of that, because again, if you are an incumbent contractor and you're interested in extending your contract, there is nothing that prevents the school district from agreeing to that extension. And on the other side of that, there's nothing that prevents them from doing an RFP either. But things like this can give some guidance and some cover to school boards that feel like they should be doing what Vince Pasquale says, or if they get in a bunch of proposals, they get one that's lower than another, they're not obligated to go with that low price purely because it is a low price. That's the rules. That first rule being the rule in Pennsylvania, the rule kind of overall of contracts. The second part being the rules locally here in Pennsylvania. So what you really want to do in your own organizations is work that into some sort of plan so that you can be certain that you have enforceable contracts on hand, not just in total, but for all of the things that you rely on, whether it's fuel clauses or routes or prompt payment, whatever that is. So in terms of a contract administration plan, it's your ability to prove you've got an enforceable contract. Some of these things are fairly straightforward and simple. Having signed, fully executed copies. Now, that may sound obvious, but we see a lot of contracts in what we do with school bus contractors here in Pennsylvania. We worked with hundreds of them, and it's surprisingly common for someone to have a question about a contract. I say, great, send me a copy, and they do. And I'll notice, well, this one is signed by you, but it wasn't signed by the school. And, they'll typically say, well, I have it somewhere, but, just take a look at this one. It's not unusual that they can't easily, sometimes ever, put their hands on the actual contract that was signed, and not just signed by the administrator, but signed by a school board member. So the time to get that is when you've made the agreement. I don't recommend that you go back and say, hey, this contract you gave us 3 years ago, I noticed I don't have it signed by you guys. Not a good plan. But, if you've been through the process and it went to the school board and they sent you a copy that says, here it is, and you notice that it's signed only by the administrator, not by the school board, that's the time to say, well, is the school board going to sign this? Or perhaps, is there a note in the school board minutes saying that the administrator, the superintendent, the transportation director, whoever, is authorized to sign blah, 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 blah. So a note in the school minutes is something that I would staple to the contract so that you can connect the dots from the document that you're holding all the way back to state law that says the only people that have the authority are the school boards themselves. So if that's the A answer, a signed, fully executed copy, the B answer would be something that is not signed, but you've got written documentation that there is certainly an agreement in place. And when we talked about informal changes through the year, every contract is a little different. Sometimes they're very, very specific. Here's your routes number 1 through 20. So if they add route 21 sometime in November, that's okay, but it may or may not ever rise to the level of an actual signed written agreement. But what I'd recommend is that you have some sort of email trail, at least, where they say, we're going to split this into 2 routes for whatever reason, and, you reply back, sounds good, we have a 72-passenger bus we can put on it, or whatever the details are. Sounds good, we'll keep this running at, our own rate, that sort of thing, at the regular rate, some record that you have. Email communication back and forth in writing is what I call a B answer. The third level, the C answer, is that verbal confirmation. And that is a situation, again, where they call you at 3 p.m. and say that Johnny needs to pick up at 6:30 a.m. And you don't have time to do the email because you got to, number one, figure out if you got a vehicle. Number two, if you got a vehicle, figure out if you got a driver. And you may not get that driver in your first call. You might have to go through 3 people, as you know. So by the time you're able to say, yep, we got you covered, it might be 6:30 p.m. But of course, you probably at 3:30 p.m. said, "Sure, no problem, I got you covered." And amen, 6:30, you got it all wrapped up, and you can probably break for lunch. But nonetheless, that whole process of verbal, the better you can do a job of at least confirming the conversation by email, that takes it from that C level to the B level of a written agreement. The fourth level is acceptance by performance. Okay, that is, you have done the work that they have asked, and while there's no evidence of it, okay, you don't have an email, people may or may not recall that you had this conversation, and this happens a lot where somebody has left. So let's say that there was a administrator within the transportation department that called you back in October and said, we have a special needs student, they need to be picked up at their house, here's where it is. You start doing that route. And then somewhere in December, perhaps somewhere in January, somebody sees this singular route and they say, why are we committing a van to pick up Johnny? He can actually be added to this route. Who authorized this? Well, Mary did. Well, Mary's not with us anymore. Okay, so you have no written documentation, and you've got no verbal documentation because Mary's not with them anymore, but you've been doing it. You've been performing it, and month after month, they've paid for this particular route. Now, that doesn't mean they can't stop the route at that point, but they can't say, well, we're not going to pay you for these routes that you've been running in the last 2 months, because there is acceptance by performance. I do the work, and I send the bill, and nobody told me to stop until today. The piece of advice that we give you when you're in this situation is to try to create some sort of written path, even if it's just an email back and forth. And I threw this sentence in here, we'll pick up Johnny or Susie or whoever the student is at 7 a.m. at 123 Main Street unless directed otherwise. So now you've taken it from that D level, by performance, and really putting it up into, I'll say, the number 2 level. You've got emails back and forth. You have defined how they can accept it. You have offered to pick up Johnny, and we'll charge our regular rate, or you might even say the rate, whatever it is in there. And if they do nothing, if they don't say, oh my gosh, no, stop, or wait, I need to get authority before you do that, well, then obviously they have broken the acceptance. But if they do nothing, and chances are they're very busy, so they will do nothing, they're just delighted that you emailed them back to say Johnny's going to have a ride tomorrow morning, you do the run, and you have created a contract where acceptance is proven by performance. It happens a lot more frequently than you'd think, especially in that run up to the new school year where things aren't really settled into place. Nobody's really sure which end is up, but someone somewhere knows that a parent is going to be real unhappy if this one child isn't on the bus, or there's not a bus there, or whatever the case is. So they may leapfrog all of the formalities, call you directly and say, you got to help me. Okay, I realize it's 4:30 p.m., but this has to happen tomorrow. And you do it. But language like this will assure that you do get paid for that work that you do. And then the last part is by pattern and practice. And this is a situation where, again, you may not have any kind of official contract, official, signing, no proposals. It's just that you have done this over and over and over, year after year, and you've always been paid. So just like acceptance by performance, there's a pattern and a practice, and you can prove that every month, every day you run this run, and they pay you this much, and your evidence is the invoices or the records of the fact that you've been doing this and have been receiving payment. Now, again, these are things that will create your right to payment for the work that you have done in the past. But it doesn't really guarantee that you've got the right to do that work going forward. That's why you want to try, to the greatest extent possible, to have all of your contracts be as strong as possible according to this contract administration plan. Now, in terms of the contract administration plan, there are a lot of elements to it, but a good contract administration plan is going to address grouping, ordering, calendaring, and self-audit protocols. The idea there is that you can't just, get your contract, be happy that you got it, and then move on. You really should treat your contract administration the same way you administer your fleet. I'm certain everybody in there has got something, a calendar, a spreadsheet, or something that tells you when's the last time we did an oil change on this bus, how many miles have happened since, when do we need to do it again, when did we, rotate the tires last, what's the last, you've got those things in place. You manage your fleet because you know that failure to manage the fleet is going to mean that it's not going to last as long. You may run into problems. And you should set up the same sort of thing for your contract administration plan. I know a lot of times someone will get a 5-year contract and they think that's great, I'm good for 5 years. Well, the reality is you should set up some calendar events for yourself and have a backup, somebody else who is in there. Maybe you have a manager, maybe a husband and a wife run the business together, put it on both calendars, but you want to have certain check-ins. You don't want to necessarily forget about it to the end of 5 years and say, oh my gosh, that's coming up in a couple of months. You want to do a check-in either at the end of each year or at the middle of the process. Or if you want to try to extend it, don't wait to the very, very last month of the very last year. Get a year ahead of it. See if you can extend a 5-year contract in year number 4, not in year number 5. And you may be able to extend it on top of the one that you have. And these extensions are going to be more and more important in Pennsylvania as there's greater and greater pressure from DePasquale and others to go to a RFP process or a bid process. So if you don't have a contract administration plan, it would be wise to come up with a plan. Where are you going to keep the contracts? What are the quality of them? Things of that sort. And when we talk about this, the quality of the contracts, one of the things that we do when we help a school bus contractor either acquire another business or sell a business is we evaluate the enforceability of the contracts. And the reality is that the more enforceable your contracts are, the more valuable they are. I've seen a situation where a contractor is retiring. They are in the process of working with someone they've identified as a potential buyer to talk about price. How much would someone pay for X number of routes and X many vehicles? While the contractors themselves are usually very comfortable evaluating the value of the fleet, they're usually less comfortable and less informed about evaluating the value of the contracts. The fleet, comparatively, is easy. How many miles, how well have they been maintained, what's the condition, all of those sorts of things. You eyeball it and you make a decision. And you pay for the fleet based on the quality of those used vehicles. Well, as far as the contracts go, same sort of thing. You have to consider the quality of that is the enforceability of the contracts. And we talked a little bit about that in the last slide. And we actually do rate them when we do one of these contract reviews for a potential buyer or seller, A through F. A being a contract that is fully executed by the board and you've got all schedules and all exhibits. Okay. It sounds like, gee, that's obvious, but candidly, it's the holy grail. I would say that a very small fraction actually has complete executed contracts with all schedules and all exhibits. And what I often find is the schedules and the exhibits are the part that kind of get lost in the mix. Because very often the contract says something like, it's got a rate, and it may be a rate by the day, it might be a rate by the mile, it might be a rate by the route. But very often the second part of that, okay, this is the rate per day or this is the rate per route, but where's that list of you've got 20 routes, not 15 routes or some other number? And that's the part that is most often missing, or just there's no dots connecting it, so to speak. So A level, fully executed by the board with all schedules, all exhibits, it's golden. Your next level down is typically something that is fully executed by the board, but you've got documents missing. Maybe there's a schedule, maybe you've got, and I've seen this actually, where the original contract was literally many renewals ago. So they've had successive renewals, maybe 3 years at a time, maybe 5 years at a time. But all the parties are unable to actually put their hands on the original signed document. Usually the contractor has a version that is signed by him, that he recalls. I gave this to the school board for their meeting, they voted on it, and now that superintendent is gone, the transportation director is gone, all those people from 10 years ago are gone, but you have a currently signed extension of this contract you can't prove. Okay, that puts it in B category, because realistically, the evidence that you had a contract to begin with needs to come before you can say, and now it's been extended for another 3 years, 5 years, 4 years, whatever that is. The C level is something that is fully executed, but by the administrator only. And it's interesting because we have a lot of discussions with contractors that say, well, the administrator is always the one that signs it. And that may be true, but go back to the state law slides that we talked about, it really needs to be signed by the school board. Now, you can bridge that gap because the school board may vote to authorize the transportation director to sign the contract. And if you've got evidence of that in the minutes, you're golden. That turns a C into an A. But a lot of times you'll have a contractor that's got it signed by the transportation director. They believe they're golden. They believe they're in A territory when actually they're in C territory. So again, the time to address that is when your contract has been signed, not necessarily in arrears, going back to a contract that has been happily paying you for multiple years. We let sleeping dogs lie, but if you believe you're going to need to rely on the enforceability of that contract at some point, maybe you're contemplating retirement, maybe you're contemplating selling a part of your routes or your business, that's when you're going to want to make those evaluations. A D contract, okay, is you've got a formal contract, but it's not signed by an administrator, it's not signed by the board, but you have a history of payment for service. And again, in operations, I see this frequently. Well, here's a copy of my email with the contract that I sent to the administrator, and he said he was going to have it signed by the board. And when that school year started 3 years ago, we started it and we send an invoice every month and we get paid every month. So you have evidence of acceptance by performance or by pattern and practice, but you don't actually have an enforceable contract that I would recommend that a buyer pay a premium for or a lot of money for. And that's what buyers come to me for. They say, well, what are the issues? What should I be aware of? Well, you should be aware that although they've been running this contract for 3 years, they don't actually have an enforceable legal contract. We can certainly prove that they've done the service for these years, that they've been paid, but that could evaporate in a phone call. We don't want you to do the service anymore. And your contract is done because you cannot prove the enforceability with an A, B, C quality contract. Next level down would be something written that is not an actual formal contract, just an email back and forth perhaps, but with a history of payment for service. And very often your informal modifications of contracts fall into this category. It's a situation where there's an email trail back and forth, you've been doing the work, you've been paid, so you can prove that there is that pattern, but again, it could all end tomorrow if a new administrator comes in or they just decide they're going to go with someone else. So that's your A, B, C, D, E. You do have another level. That's F. You got nothing. That's, again, something that you stumble upon now and again. When someone, a buyer or seller, is saying, they say they've got, 30 routes, we actually will look at all of the documents and contracts and grade them A through F. And believe it or not, there are sometimes things that fall into the F categories. They say activity runs. I do all their activity runs. And, it may be a situation where, okay, last year you did them and you got paid. So, yep, there is a pattern in practice, But saying that you did the activity runs last year because they asked you to and you did is far weaker than saying I've been picking up Johnny at 123 Main Street every day for 90 of the last 180 days. That's pattern and practice that's got great value. To say that I did the activity runs last year, so I expect I'll do them this year, that falls into the F category, I would say. But you kind of get the concept there. So getting away from the gradings, and let's talk about what happens in Pennsylvania. Most often, it's an informal process. I see a lot of times a school district will want they'll have a need, and they may reach out informally to a contractor and say, hey, would you send us a proposal? And that's a contract offer. It's most often the offer is made by the contractor in response to an informal request by a school district. And in Pennsylvania, that's kind of the way they roll. It's not real formal very often. It's getting more formal, but historically this has been the way. The second one is an extension of an existing contract, and this is most often a simple 1 or 2 page document. It may update the pricing, it may update the term, that sort of thing. And the advice here is start your pitch early. Don't necessarily wait until the very last year and you've got 4 or 5 months left, and now you're going to talk about extending it. Now, I say start your pitch early, but I do have to share with you that there are some people that ascribe to the other side of that coin. An RFP takes time, and typically they'll go out in December-ish so that they can get responses in January-ish, so that if they're going to accept one of them and make some changes, an incoming contractor would have time to gear up, to get buses, to get a facility, to understand the lay of the land. So I know of contractors that take the tactical delay. They say, well, if my contract is up in June of 2019, I'm going to call them 15 days before. And they're not going to have time to do an RFP and to go and get another contractor to consider doing anything other than extending it with me. Now, that may be a win, or it may be a situation where they offer you a 1-year extension. And I've seen that happen too. And that puts a contractor in a tough spot because nobody wants a 1-year contract, but you also don't want to be out in the cold. So all of those things go into the mix regarding timing. I put a bullet down here for people because extensions also will matter in terms of the relationships you have with the various people. And you need to consider that the administrators, whether it's transportation director, business manager, or superintendent, are certainly going to have probably the most direct interaction with you. And they will be the ones that say, yes, this is working great, and I don't want to make any changes. I want to just extend this for another however many years. Less direct interaction is the school board of directors. And if you don't know your school board of directors, finding some way to interact with them is a really good idea. I know a lot of times contractors are a little nervous about reaching out to the school board or just randomly showing up. So we recommend that you take the opportunity in a positive light. So for example, if you have a driver who has been got a safe driving record for 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is, why don't you ask your administrator if you can give them a certificate from the school or the school board recognizing 10 years of accident-free service, blah, 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 blah. It gives you the opportunity. I mean, who is really going to say no to that? They have a school board meeting. You've got an opportunity to shake hands and take pictures. They put it on their Facebook page. You put it on your Facebook page. Maybe the local newspaper covers it. It's a feel-good story. But it gives you a positive reason to get in front of your school board and shake their hand and to look them in the eye and for them to remember that you're a good guy with good drivers. How about that? Okay, instead of waiting until a driver was late and everybody is excited and angry and now you've got to go in to be defensive. You've got to explain that, no, it's not like this. I've got lots of good drivers, many of them accident-free for 10 plus years. Okay, that's not the great way to create that relationship. So look for those opportunities to do that sort of thing. The solicitors are also in the mix, and you won't necessarily have reason, hopefully you won't have reason to deal with those solicitors, but I deal with a lot of them. So very often, if you know who the solicitor is, if you want a little bit of info on, yep, they're great to deal with, or no, they're not great to deal with, or even they're great to deal with, but they're primarily people dealing with teacher contracts or construction contracts. They don't speak the school bus transportation language. And, some of them can be taught, but some of them don't understand that there's a huge difference between a construction contract and a transportation contract. The last two on this is the parents and the public. And I segregate those two because the interest of the parents are going to be different from the interest of the public. The parent wants safe and efficient transportation. The public wants low taxes. So again, depending on who you're interacting with, will depend on how you tout your services. But understand that these are the players, and the better you are at minding your audience and playing to your audience, the better you will be situated when it comes to either making an offer or making an extension. In Pennsylvania, if it's not one of those informal offer situations, it is most often an RFP, that is, request for proposal. Now, there's a second process, which we call a request for bid, and technically the difference between the two is up here on your screen. A request for proposal is commonly used when the deliverables, that is the routes, are not well defined, or when other selection criteria, like contractor preference, history of service, will be used in addition to price. So again, a school may do a request for proposal, and that's not a terrible thing, okay? It may show that your pricing is reasonable. And though it may also say that, okay, we did get a lower price from someone, but we prefer to stay with this contractor because they have a great record and years of service with our school district. The second one is slightly different. That is a request for bid. And in some states, there are statutory requirements that say transportation has to go through a bid process. And a bid process is different from a proposal process. In that proposal process, go back to those statutes in that case that I showed you a few slides ago. They can go with anyone, and price isn't the lowest driver. In a bid process, and it's most often in things like construction or things of that sort, where their commodities are for clear specifications, or when it's required by statute, and usually price is the determining factor. I mean, if you need a 10,000 square foot building built, you can have blueprints and specifications. So the commodity, what do I need? I need a 10,000 square foot building, is definable, and it's the same no matter who's bidding on it. But if you say, I need all of the students to get safely to school and back, well, we understand that, but it's not as detailed as saying I want a 10,000 square foot building. So in Pennsylvania, the process rolls forward through RFPs, not RFBs. But stay tuned and watch the legislative reports that you get from the Pennsylvania School Bus Association. If legislation of that sort comes along, this is where the difference of a word can make a huge difference in your experience as a Pennsylvania contractor. So RFPs we'll talk about because that's fairly common in Pennsylvania. And here what you want to do is be aware of the deadlines, the questions, the exceptions that you have. Be aware also that in Pennsylvania you can collect comparative data by right to know requests. So I've got contractors that have for decades served a school district, and they're now for the first time going through an RFP process. And it's foreign to them because they've never done it. It's been however many years, decades, literally. So what I recommend that they do, and they may do this themselves, or we may assist them so that they can remain anonymous if they want, and get the public records of contracts from the districts around you. What are other contractors charging, and how do they structure their proposal? Are they bidding by the day, by the bus, by the mile? All of those things. You can collect comparative data through right to know requests, and typically you can get that pretty quickly. There's usually an opportunity to participate in pre-bid meetings, and there may even be a question and answer forum online. So when you get the documents, you don't necessarily have to scratch your head and wonder. You can attend one of these pre-bid meetings, or you can go through the online Q&A forums. You should understand that very often it's not necessarily well regarded to call directly to the person or the administrator that's putting the bid out. They sometimes just get nervous about, well, I'm talking to you, I should be talking to everybody, which is why they do these Q&As in either open meetings or on online forums. And when you're putting your proposal together, one of the things that I always recommend is two things. Include alternatives and include a list of exceptions. And don't be bashful about both of those things. You'll certainly see language in an RFP that says your proposal has to match exactly the request, and if not, we reserve the right to reject it, and all this other kind of baloney in Pennsylvania. The reality is you might say, well, okay, if I can use 2 buses on this route instead of 1, I can do this, or it might even be that. It might be that, hey, you know what, I think I can do better. You've asked for 20 routes. I think I can do it with 19, and here's how. Or you may have alternatives that are like, I'll do it at this rate if I have to buy the fuel, but I'll do it at this rate if you buy the fuel through the IU. Or it may be, I'll do it at this rate if you give me a fuel clause that kicks in at X dollars an hour. So don't be bashful about putting alternatives in. And the last part, exceptions, is something you shouldn't be bashful about either. We'll talk about contract considerations, and those contract considerations where you might look at the indemnity terms and say, wow, I had my lawyer look at this, and I don't think my insurance is going to cover the risk that they're looking to transfer to me. So you should still bid, but you should have a sheet that lists out the exceptions. We bid this, ABC XYZ price, but except we would like to negotiate agreeable language on the indemnity terms to eliminate the transfer of broad indemnity, which is not covered under Pennsylvania insurance policies. So it is typical that you'll have a list of exceptions, and those exceptions most often are the legal interpretations. It may be not an exception, but a clarification. Looking at a contract recently, there was a fuel clause that it addressed the fuel, and it was the intent was that the school would purchase the fuel through the IU, and that the contractor would reimburse that cost through deductions on the monthly invoices. Then it started to talk about a fuel clause that kicked in at a certain price. And it had language that called that kick-in price the base price. Well, when you read it all together, it really sounded like, okay, we're going to buy the fuel from the IU, and you're going to pay the base price. Well, no, actually, we're going to pay what the IU charged you. But if the base price comes in, that's when the fuel clause. So we wanted to change the word base price to trigger price, because it wasn't actually the base, it was the trigger. So that's where, again, the importance of listing that out when you're putting your RFP together is really critical, because then when you get to the point where you've been granted the contract and now you need to put it into words that someone's going to sign, that's that situation where you want to be able to point to your exception sheet and say, well, hey, when I bid this, I said we wanted to get acceptable language to make it clear that we reimburse you at the IU rate, and that if the cost hits $4 a gallon, we're going to share the cost after that. The exception might be a clarification. The exception might be something straight up that you're looking to avoid. Increasingly, school districts are asking for performance bonds. And, we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about things like that. But you want to look carefully, and if that performance bond is going to be a problem, you'll want to point that out. That's a great segue into our next slide, which is contract considerations. Costs, obviously, probably your biggest consideration. Look to see if the RFP you're responding to requires bonds, a particular insurance limit. What's the age of the fleet requirement? Is there special equipment requirements, whether it's cameras or stop arms, or not just cameras, a forehead camera, whatever the case is? How's the fuel clause written? Is there specific staffing needs? Do you have to dedicate a supervisor or a dispatcher, or who pays for the aides, things of that sort? Also, look to see if there is an opening/termination clause if costs rise. For a second, let's talk about bonds. And like I said, increasingly, I see the bonding requirement. And I think that the reason I see that is because a lot of school districts are doing RFPs for the first time, And what they do is they go to a high-powered attorney firm, Stock and Leader, or one of those other ones that serve school districts. And these guys come at it like high-paid lawyers would come at it. Okay, I'm going to give you a 30-page RFP, and it's going to request everything plus the kitchen sink. And they'll very often put a bond requirement in there because it's common in construction. Now, the important thing to know is that that bond is not insurance, it is a bond. If you have auto insurance and you back into somebody's car, the insurance company pays for the damage to the other car, and your rates may go up a little bit, but they're going to pay the $10,000 to fix the car you backed into. In a bond, it's the same dynamic, but the difference is after they pay the $10,000 on the bond, they actually come to you to say, okay, now that I've covered your liability, you need to pay me back the $10,000. Okay, so that's a dynamic that some contractors not familiar with bonds don't quite, maybe haven't experienced. The other part of that is it actually ties up your balance sheet because it shows as a liability on your books. Very often, they'll look for a performance bond, meaning they want you to get a bond equal to the annual cost of the contract. And the concept is that if you fail to perform, they'll be able to use the bond money to pay someone else to do it. Okay. Now, the problem is, again, that bond shows up as a liability because in the scenario I just described, you are really obligated to pay it if they pay out on the bond. That may not sound like a bad thing until you try to finance new buses that you want to purchase, or perhaps a new building that you want to purchase. And the bank does the evaluation of your financial stability, and they say, well, yeah, you're doing fine, but you've got this multi-million-dollar obligation sitting on your books in this form of this bond. So don't be bashful about saying bonds are ridiculous in a transportation setting. And I could go on and on about that, but very, very often you can get them to back away from a bond requirement. But importantly, understand that those costs are there. Term, I would really consider being creative when you set out your term. If they're willing to give you a 3-year agreement or a 5-year agreement, offer to do them the 3-year or the 5-year with the right to extend by mutual agreement for another 2 years, or better than that, for successive 2-year terms, or however many. And the reason that I say that is, think forward. If Vince DiPasquale is pushing people, the legislature, to have a RFP requirement or a bid requirement, it could happen. If it does happen, they're not going to reach back and disturb contracts that are in place. A requirement like that is most likely going to affect contracts going forward. So if you have a contract that has a extension for 2-year terms by mutual agreement, conceivably, you could extend that in perpetuity. And again, we can help you with these sorts of things, but it's something to consider as you're putting your contracts together. Termination, look carefully at the termination clauses. Termination for convenience is another concept that came out of construction contracts that has made its way into transportation contracts, and it really makes no sense. You get a 5-year contract, and then you look at the termination clause, and it says that the school district can terminate for any reason or no reason on 90 days notice. Well, you don't actually have a 5-year contract, you have a 90-day contract. And again, a bank looking at that is going to say, well, if they can terminate at any time, you want me to lend you, hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy these buses, I need more security than that. So very often we can get them to get rid of the for convenience language and go to for cause language, meaning we can terminate if you fail to perform in one way or another. And we want to make sure that for cause is actually defined, so that's clear. Assignment typically requires approval, but we want to make sure that that approval is not unreasonably withheld. And again, you may not be thinking about selling your business, but things happen. People may decide to retire. Medical issues come up. Your business may change. Whatever it is, it doesn't cost them anything to have reasonable assignment terms, and that's usually the argument on that. The indemnity terms, 3 levels of indemnity: broad, intermediate, and limited. Limited and intermediate is good. Your insurance policies will cover that. Broad indemnity is that situation where you are expected to reimburse for the liabilities created by the school for actions that you had no hand in. So just by its definition, it's really kind of out there as a concept, but you do see it from time to time, and that's the sort of thing that we would list as an exception. Very often when contractors we're working with on their bids, they take care of what I'll call the pricing and equipment and all that kind of stuff, and they'll ask us to look at the RFP, look at the contracts, and help them prepare the exceptions sheet. So it may be that you put your prices together, we give you an exception sheet, you put it together, and that's your proposal. That's kind of the rundown. I think I've kind of run to my 11 o'clock time frame. So Mike, I'm not sure if we've had any questions out there. If we have, I'd be happy to answer them, or you could turn the phones on, however you think is best to address that.
Okay, I have, let's start this way. I have a couple of questions that have been submitted, so we'll start there. First is, there is not any term limit or number of years limited for contracts by the state, question marks. In other words, does the state have any requirements for minimum or maximum contract terms?
Good question. And in Pennsylvania, the answer is currently no. There is no term limit. You can have a contract for as short or as long as you'd like in Pennsylvania. But I know, Mike, you follow the legislation pretty closely. I know some of the RFP bills that have been bandied about in recent years have proposed limits as short as 2 years. Is that right?
That's correct. The last competitive bidding bill that went out that we met with the sponsor on limited to only 2 years, and we were able to put forward a pretty strong argument as to why that just didn't make any sense. It didn't hurt that the legislator himself was a small business owner and understood the need to be able to assure your client, assure your lenders that you're going to your people financing, your new equipment, et cetera, that they were going to need a little more than a 2-year contract to continue to provide the kind of equipment you're all providing to your districts.
Right.
So
and I'll add to my answer. The most common terms that I see are 3 years or 5 years. I see occasionally 7 years. I see occasionally 10 years. They're not real common. 3 and 5 seems to be very common, but I always recommend if you get a 3 or a 5, offer to do a 2-year extension by mutual agreement on top of your 3 or 5. Also understand that if you have a 10-year contract, it's hard to say what school transportation is going to look like in 10 years. So, there's that to think about.
Yep.
What other questions do we have, Mike?
Well, and that was one of the other questions. Well, I have a couple, but one was, are you seeing any trends in lengths of contract? And I think you just answered what you're seeing in that right now. Another one, are you hearing or seeing any has to do with new technology included in contracts? For example, GPSs and Wi-Fi's. Are people including those kinds of things in their contracts, or districts coming to contractors for that?
Yeah, the two most common that I see are dictating that your camera systems have to have 4 heads, not just a simple bulkhead camera or something of that sort. And it might even be more than 4. I know now they've got cameras, looking forward on the street or backwards or all that sort of thing. So increasingly, and the difficulty there is very often a contractor has already put cameras in their entire fleet that work fine, and it's going to be an extra cost to move to a multi-head camera system, that sort of thing. The other thing that I see a lot of is there are a number of apps that people are peddling to parents that will track the bus. I forget the names off the top of my head, but the idea is you have an app on your phone and you can tell that the bus is 3 blocks away and it's heading your way, that sort of thing. So I see a lot of contracts that are wanting the contractors to participate in that and that sort of thing. That's the 2 biggest ones. Good.
Excellent. I got another question, and this is, I thought I read somewhere, possibly the PSBA newsletter, and yes, that is where you read it, that schools were required to RFP if the contract would displace unionized employees. Is that true? Rich, do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. And there's an article that we did Right, in Legal Focus, as I recall.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that did actually pass. Am I remembering that right, Mike?
It did,
That
and in fact, it was a last minute passage last year's budget that included a bill that we started scurrying about because it talked about competitive bidding or RFPs, and what it really Rich, we can always this comes John Ox put this one in. We can always get that article back out.
Absolutely.
What it did deal with, John and everybody else, was as school districts continue to look at ways to contract out. This was, we believe, a PSBA type bill that was meant to save union jobs. That said, if you were already in a unionized setting and you have bus drivers that are currently unionized and you're going to contract out, it did set forth a process that included an RFP and a board and holding a public meeting and a variety of stuff. But we can get that out. But yes.
And I do remember now I do now remember the backstory to that. And legislation always comes from an angle. The angle here was that school districts, regarding teaching staff, not transportation, were increasingly taking segments of their teaching staff, maybe it's special needs or gym or whatever it is, and they would outsource it. So they would say, okay, we're going to take the music department, and instead of hiring a music teacher, the so-and-so company is going to come in and do music classes, every day or once a week or whatever it is. And the teachers union was the one that said, wait a minute, you're contracting and it's displacing unionized teachers. And the issue here is, if you do a takeover as a transportation provider and you displace a unionized driving force, if you hire more than 50% of the unionized staff, you're already required by federal law to recognize the union and to bargain with them. But on these one-offs, like outsourcing the music teacher, okay, you're not hiring 50% of the staff. You're simply getting rid of a music teacher in favor of a subcontracted agreement, which is probably cheaper for you. So the motivation behind the bill was the teachers union didn't want unionized workers to be displaced by subcontracted workers. So in that budget bill, they had that provision, and it's very narrowly written. So the only time it's really going to matter for a school bus contractor is if you're doing a conversion, meaning that you are displacing a school-operated fleet with a fleet operated by you. And by federal law, you would already be required to recognize the union if you hire more than 50% of the workers. So it wasn't really a big impact to us, but that's just kind of be aware of it. And if you're in that situation, certainly my phone number's up there. Give us a call. We can answer more detailed questions for you too.
Yeah, because as a follow-up, John asks, taking it further then, if a district does own their own transportation and is unionized and decides to outsource, they do need an RFP. And Rich, I think, again, we'd have to go back and look at that process in that legislation, in that bill.
Right. And in fact, I've been involved in situations where a school district has come to a single provider and said, we would like you to make a proposal. In other words, they don't go through an RFP process. This is back in history. This is before that bill passed. And very often it was because they couldn't afford to upgrade their fleet. They couldn't, the cost of buying new buses was prohibitive. So they said, well, let's outsource it, and then it's somebody else's problem, that sort of thing. But under this new provision, you should be aware of that. If you're being asked to do a conversion and they haven't gone through an RFP, then you might want to, we should probably chat. If they have gone through an RFP and it's, a unionized workforce, they've already gone through the process, so it doesn't matter.
Beautiful. Yep. Thanks, John. John just said thank you. That helped him a lot. John, again, feel free to call Rich if you have specific questions regarding that.
Great. Any other questions out there, Mike?
Any other questions? I'll tell you what I'll do. I don't know if I can unmute everybody at this point. So, can we start another question? Can we still reach out to Rich and have him read over our current new contracts? As he said, usually outside lawyers only look at school bus our lawyer only looks at school bus. Can we still reach out to Rich and have him read over our current and new contracts? In other words,
are
you available to do that, Rich?
I am. That's what the Business Counsel program is all about. As a member, we help you out with those sorts of things. Obviously, we can do a lot of quick reviews and things like that. We do have some contractors that will then say, well, we'd really like your help with drafting modified language and things like that. And, obviously that would be a different level, but we can absolutely help you. Give us a call.
Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Excellent questions. Rich, thank you again. And Ashley said thank you very much for all that information. You see Rich's information up on the screen. Obviously, you can also find their information on the PSBA website or on their own website at rckelly.com. Everyone on the call will be getting a survey to follow up on this for this webinar, and the recording of the webinar will also be posted on the members or a link to it on the members only section, and it'll be on our YouTube page, not our Yahoo page. So again, we thank everybody. Keep your eye out. We have another presentation coming up on identity theft coming up in February, but you'll be able to catch Rich again at our regional meetings coming up in March also. So again, we thank you all. Rich, thank you so much for everything. And
thank you,
without any other questions, we'll stand adjourned. Have a great day, everybody, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.